Oh, we are recording. Okay. Yeah. All right. First off, let's just say we are here. It is October 30th, 1999 in Covington, Kentucky. We are here with the 53rd annual reunion of the 12th Armored Division. And I am here in front of Julian Johnson. He is with the B Company of the 66th AIB. Let me just get started by asking you about your childhood, about where you were raised and your family.
I grew up in the southern part of Virginia, Danville, Virginia, which is very close to the North Carolina line, and grew up on a farm. We raised primarily tobacco, and I grew up and went to school there, and then I left there and went to Washington and worked in construction work. Matter of fact, I worked on the Pentagon for about a year before I was drafted into the service. And
what did your parents do?
They were farmers.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And I was the youngest of 8 children. Mm-hmm. So when I was drafted into the service, I was sent out to Camp Campbell, Kentucky, and was assigned to Company B of the 66th 12th Armored Division, and stayed with them throughout the entire war until 1946. From Erlangen, and from there I was assigned to 1st Armored Division in the Army of Occupation.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back a little bit. Let's just start off by asking you about if you decided to, if you ever thought about enlisting, or you were just ready for them to draft you?
At that time they had closed the enlistment. They were only taking people in through the draft. Otherwise, I would have enlisted, I think, because then I would have enlisted for a choice. But as it worked out, the 12th Armored was a good assignment.
Great. So you went from Camp Campbell to where?
Well, we went from Campbell to Abilene and spent approximately a year in Abilene. And from there, we went to POE, Camp Shanks, New York. And from there, went to England. And we stayed in England, and we drew new equipment, and I don't know, probably 6 weeks, 2.5, 3 months, and then we moved over to France, went into Le Havre, and from there we went up through France into Germany and to Austria.
Did you have any problems with the ship, the ship ride over?
Except for the food. We only had 2 meals a day, but if you had sufficient dollars, you could go down to the kitchen and buy. It was a British ship, and you could buy an apple for $1. You could buy a hamburger for $2. But most of the GIs, I think, they just come off leave and probably didn't have that much money. Don't forget, we were not making lots of money in those days, so. The ship wasn't really uncomfortable. It was a German ship from World War I, Empress of Australia, and the British had taken it as part of their war booty. So in all, it was not a pleasure cruise, but not all that uncomfortable.
And you landed in Le Havre, or?
No, we went into Southampton, England, and we stayed in England down in Salisbury for 2 or 3 months, and then we crossed over the Channel to France.
And what was your thought of being in Europe?
I was excited. A big adventure. Mm-hmm. I mean, for a 20-year-old, you're excited about things like that. I'd never been hard out of the state of Virginia. So I was excited about the travels, going to Europe, seeing how the other half lived. I was always interested in history. So going to Europe, of course, was a chance to me to see some of the things I had read about in history books.
Did you get any leave time while you were at the beginning?
Had one short leave before going overseas, and that was it. I think probably 10 days, 2 weeks at the most. But I think we had, everybody had a chance to go home that wanted to from Texas before we shipped out to New York on to England. I don't think anyone that I was aware of was denied leave.
Well, when you arrived into England, did you get any weekend passes or anything like that?
Had one weekend pass to London, and that was an experience. The buzz bombs came in while we were there, and that was exciting. But of course, trying to move around at night under blackout conditions, it was very difficult. So usually what you do is get into your hotel room, lodge in by the time it got dark, and you'd stay there until next morning and then come out, because completely unfamiliar city, and it was blacked out, and there wasn't really anyone out on the street to ask directions. So most of us just went in, and once it started getting dark, and just stayed in.
Good. Good.
But in the daytime, though, we were able to get out and sightsee, see Westminster Abbey, London Bridge, the Palace, Buckingham Palace, and places like that that you'd read about. So that was fascinating.
So once you got your equipment, where did you go next?
We went down to the port down on the southeast coast of England, and loaded up on LSTs, landing ship tanks, and we crossed over to Le Havre and offloaded there onto the beach docks, and for that we moved on inland.
What was your first experience in actual battle?
Frightening. And I shouldn't say that too glibly, because you have a lot of respect for the enemy. But the first experience really was hearing the artillery going out. But being so new at the game, wasn't sure what was going out or coming in. So you didn't know whether to duck or to stand outside and see what was going on. But after you had some incoming artillery, then you got a little bit smarter. You learned to realize the difference between incoming artillery and outgoing artillery.
Good. So do you still recall the exact route of your experiences through Europe?
Yes, I have been over that route on vacation, going back to Europe. My wife and myself have traveled that route. As a matter of fact, 4 years ago, I took my daughter and her husband and grandson back, and we didn't travel the complete route, but most of it, especially around Herlesheim and Colmar, Strasbourg, and went down and crossed the bridge at Dulligan and went to Landsberg and on down near the Austrian border. So I have been over it probably 2 or 3 times. But things have changed so much in the last 30, 40, 50 years that many of the places are just completely unfamiliar. They build new roads and build high-rise apartment houses, office complexes, and so forth. You don't remember the little villages that you saw in 1944. They're no longer there. They're there, but they have been built up and built around and changed so much that it's very difficult to recognize.
Well, tell me about Colmar.
Colmar was a fascinating place. That's where I got frozen feet. We went in supposedly to work with the French, and we went in with the idea of driving the Germans back. This was one of the last pockets of resistance of the Germans on this side of the over in French territory. So General Eisenhower was under pressure from General de Gaulle to push the Germans out. So we went in and we did just that. It took a We lost some people doing it, and we lost some tanks and half-tracks and jeeps and so forth. But in general, we were able to push the Germans out. The French, of course, were coming in, and it was kind of funny. Once we had captured the town, the French came in and had a big celebration. So, you know, they have a lot of national pride. This spring, April, we were in France on a vacation, and our tour guide was a nice French lady whose father was in the military service at Colmar. And she got very excited when I told her that I had been to Colmar. And her father was the aide-de-camp to the French general. But I didn't tell her that they didn't do very well, but that was just our secret.
Well, what about crossing the Diligent Bridge?
We went across. Mr. Porter, who is here, and also another man were the two first people, and they were in C Company to cross the bridge. And of course, once he got across the bridge and diffused all of the explosives on the bridge, the 500-pound bombs and the dynamite, we were able to then move rapidly across. And once we got across, the Germans kind of started collapsing. Of course, we were then getting into Germany. So we saw how the Germans lived. And one of the things that impressed me most was the slave labor camps. Not concentration camps, these were slave labor camps. And all different nationalities, the Polish, the Russians, the Czechs, the French. It was a hodgepodge of people working in these slave labor camps. And almost every German town had, and you could recognize the buildings that they lived in, these small, dark, wooden buildings. And they had some type of security fence around them. And these people would come out to greet us, and they were dressed in their, excuse me, their uniforms. It was white with stripes on them. But some of the people were in such poor condition that they were not able to come out to beg for food from us. And we were told not to give them food because we would probably do their digestive system more harm by giving them C rations or D rations or whatever. Because right behind us was people trained to handle these people who were hungry. Now, how far back, how many days back before these people actually got nourishment, I don't know. But we liberated thousands and thousands of these people who came out. And of course, the Germans were kind of amazed. Where did these people come from? Yeah, they'd never seen them before, which was a bald-faced lie that they were telling us to, I guess, so they wouldn't be looked at so cruelly. And after crossing the bridge, we eventually ended up in Landsberg. And this was a fascinating story. This is where Hitler had been in prison when he wrote his book, Mein Kampf. And we saw the prison there, and they had blown the bridge across the river there. But the railroad bridge was still intact, so quickly the engineers put planking across the bridge, and we were able to move our tanks and half-tracks across and keep moving forward. But we were there for about probably half a day waiting for them to get the railroad bridge in condition to cross over. And it was interesting looking at the town and the building where Hitler had been in prison. At that time, I didn't know which building it was. But, excuse me, but late I was able to go back and actually go into the building and see where he had been in prison and where he had written his book.
So tell me your experience of Hurlsheim.
It was dark, it was cold, and there was so much noise. It's just unbelievable. In a battle like that, the noise that is generated by our guns firing, the Germans' guns firing, the artillery going off, the hand grenades going off, that it's deafening. It's really frightening. And plus the fact that the wounded are coming back, they're calling back for ammunition to be shipped forward. People are running out of ammunition. And you don't know. There was really void, and this is one of the problems that I had during World War II, was a lack of information. The average GI didn't know what was going on. I'm not sure the average squad leader or platoon sergeant knew what was going on except in his small area of responsibility. So we had no idea. We had no maps. And we didn't have any communication from above coming down from the battalion to the company to the platoons down to the squads on what was going on, what was expected. We might say, well, there's a few Germans up ahead, we're going to go up and chase them out. Well, it was much more to it than that. It would have been nice if we had had more information as to exactly what was going on, what was expected of us, what they want us to do, and excuse me, what the Germans were really up to. But in many cases now, the intelligence people, the S2 and the G2 people, didn't really have good intelligence on what was up ahead. You can think about this in retrospect, years later. They just didn't know in Hurlsheim what we were facing. You could say, well, the intelligence people should have known, but we didn't have a telephone call. If we could call up and ask our local spy over on the German side, how many people do they have, how many tanks, what units are they facing, we didn't have that. So that would have been nice had we had that, but it didn't work that way. But I was in B Company and we were in reserve. Even so, we were within a few hundred yards of where C Company and A Company were up forward. And as they would have a break in their lines, we would be thrown into that. So C Company took a terrible beating there. I really admire those people. And they lost a lot of people killed and a lot of people wounded and captured. So I think you don't talk to, I haven't talked to any of the people here from C Company that went over and stayed with the unit during the entire war. Most of them either captured or wounded or whatever. And the otherwise, the ones came in later as replacements. So there are very few people from A and C, and also the 17th Infantry Battalion, which is our sister battalion. They had similar situations. They had terrible losses as well. The infantry took a pretty bad beating there. But we came back and we redeemed ourselves.
Were you ever wounded during war?
Never. Never had a scratch.
Wow. Good for you. Did you have any involvement with the local people?
No.
During the war?
Only once we got into Germany, but not in France. So we had, most of our stay in France was living out in tents, out in fields and so forth, so there was no interplay between the GIs and the French civilians. I imagine some of the units, some of the people did, but in my particular situation, except one exception in Thanksgiving of 1945, I went out with the executive officer in a Jeep to trade coffee for cider. And we were going to serve cider with Thanksgiving dinner. We had turkey for Thanksgiving dinner. So we used 5-gallon water cans and went out and we would bought a pound of coffee for 5 gallons of cider. At that time, the French were very, very happy to do business with us, so they would break out the Calvados, which is an apple brandy. Very, very potent. So they would pour out a small glass, then put a cube of sugar in it to try to tone it down a little bit. That was the same liquid that they used in their lamps for light at night. So that gives you an idea of the volatility of it. Well, we got enough cider for the company to have for Thanksgiving.
Do you remember where you were when they notified you that the war was over?
I think, again, it's the fact we had no maps and we're never exactly sure where we were, but I think we were just across the border into Austria. I know it was a very, very happy moment, and we had captured some cognac factories several weeks before, and we had liberated some of these small wooden barrels of cognac, about probably 15 gallons. I think they were about 45 liters, and we were carrying those in a half-track, knowing that the war was going to be over momentarily. So, excuse me. So when the war did end, we had a big party, and we used some of that liberated cognac that we had from the cognac factory that we had captured, and so we had a big party. We stayed then in that position for 2 or 3 days, and then we moved back up into Germany. It was a very good feeling. Just really a feeling of relief. You could touch yourself and say, I made it. I made it. I don't know how many of B Company, the original group that went over, was still there when the war ended. For example, our company commander, and I can't vouch for this to be in a fact, but I was told that he was wounded 5 times. He'd be wounded, go back for a couple of days to the aid station, he'd be back. One of the things that I knew, for instance, was he was hit by an 8-gauge shell. He was in the tank, working, coordinating the assault, and the hatch of the tank flew over and hit him on top of his head. And as a result of that, he had a fractured skull and developed lockjaw from it. He was gone a couple of weeks that time, and when he came back, he never smoked, but he had a box of cigars. And the doctor told him, keep a cigar in your mouth, keep your jaws open, exercise them. So I ended up smoking a lot of his cigars for him. He didn't like them. I did. But going back to B Company, I'm not sure of the people. We'd get replacements in, and a day or 2 days later, they would be gone. You wouldn't even learn their names or where they were from, anything about them. So they would come in, usually at night. These things would take place at night, and the people would be brought in, and a runner would take them up to the 1st platoon, 2nd squad, and the squad leader would indoctrinate them for 2 or 3 minutes, saying, this is our position tonight, be alert. And usually those people were so frightened, you didn't have to tell them, remind them to stay awake. But that was one of the major problems that I had as an individual, was being deprived of sleep. That was my major problem, was the fact that there wasn't adequate time or place to sleep. So I'm sure many other people had similar problems.
You mentioned earlier that you went through Army of Occupation. How long were you in that?
I went into the 1st Armored Division and went to the 6th Armored Infantry Battalion, which is a similar battalion to the 66. And the 1st had just come up from Italy. And I was assigned to the 6th Armored Infantry Battalion, and I stayed with them until they were reorganized into the U.S. Constabulary. This was really the Army of Occupation. The Constabulary was organized into mechanized cavalry squadrons or armored cavalry regiments. And I was in the 14th Armored Cavalry Regiment, and I stayed with them until November 1949. So I stayed on in Germany, and I saw many, many changes made in the German economy. Eventually the Deutsche Mark, the wartime marks were replaced by a newer mark which was of some value. There was food available on the local market for the Germans. In 1945, 46, you could take a pack of cigarettes and buy a bushel of potatoes. That currency was just absolutely worthless. So the constabulary unit that I was in, we ran border patrols on the East German border, we called the Russian border, between, north of Frankfurt up to the Castle area. And of course, north of Castle was getting into the British occupied sector. So we would run border patrol, and we would check out the Germans who were crossing the borders, check the people on the trains, looking for black market activity, smuggling. And at that time, they were trying to round up the refugees and ship them back to wherever they came from. The Russians were demanding that all of our people be returned to them. The Russians that had been captured by the Germans knew that when they got back, the two things were going to happen. Either they were going to be sent to a slave labor camp in Russia, or they would be shot, because the Russians considered them, because they were captured, as traitors. They did not want to go back, and they were forced to go back. They were physically loaded onto the trains by Russian soldiers who came over to select these people out of these refugee camps. And I'm sure that they got some people that loaded on the train that were not Russians. They may have been Czechs or Polish or whatever. But if they looked like Russians, they got loaded on the train and sent back to Russia. They loaded them in these boxcars and locked the door, and off they went, just like the Germans had done to them.
So what exactly did you do in your Army of Occupation?
I was in the maintenance program at that time, in maintaining the vehicles. We had heavy tanks and light tanks and armored cars and jeeps and trucks. And I was by that time I'd been promoted to master sergeant, and I was the regimental maintenance sergeant. So it was to try to keep the vehicles running and looking nice so that the colonel wouldn't be too unhappy with us.
So do you remember the date that you were allowed to go home, United States?
No, it was in the late fall, November probably of 1949, and I came back and was assigned to the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment at Fort Meade, Maryland. And I stayed there for about a year, and then I made warrant officer, and I went into explosive ordnance disposal, which is bomb disposal. And they sent us up to New Jersey for training, and stayed there for about a year, and then got orders to go to Korea. So I spent 16 months in Korea. And while I was over there, my daughter was having problems with asthma. So the doctor had told my wife, tell your husband if he has a choice when he comes back from Korea to try to get into a dry climate. So I went to personnel and put in my wish list where I would like to be assigned, and I asked for Albuquerque, New Mexico. I had been out there to school at the Special Weapons School. So lo and behold, when I got orders to come back, I was assigned to the school there, Armed Forces Special Weapons School, and I was going to be an instructor in the school. So that meant a 4-year stabilized assignment, which was wonderful. By then we had 2 children, a girl and a boy, and so we came back to, I came back to the States and picked up the family. They were living in Virginia, and we went out to Albuquerque, and I stayed there in the school for 4 years teaching. And then I went with a special weapons unit, these are nuclear weapons units, to Germany on a NATO assignment. And I spent 3 years in Germany. This was an interesting assignment. It was a NATO assignment, and we were stationed with a Belgian Army post, and we supported the Dutch and the British and the Belgians and the Germans. So our oldest daughter at that time went to the Canadian school because they had their classes in English. And the 2 boys, we had a second child by then, went to the German school. And so they both, especially the youngest one, he just soaked up German like a sponge. And so fortunately, unfortunately, after the 3 years was up, we had to come back to the States. We loved it over there. We did a lot of traveling over there. And we had a Sears Roebuck tent, and we would put on the top of the rack of a Volkswagen, and the 5 of us would load up, and we'd go camping in Belgium or Holland or France or Norway. But unfortunately, that came to an end and had come back to the States and was assigned to the Presidio San Francisco. And I spent the 2 years there on the staff as a nuclear weapons officer and retired there in 1965.
So where are you at living now?
We're living in Virginia. Retired. After I retired at the Presidio, I went to Omaha and went to the University of Omaha under the Bootstrap program, which was a program designed primarily for military who, see, I'd been going to school at night for years, off and on every place that I was located. If they offered night courses, I would try to take 1 or 2. So I went into Nebraska, Omaha, and I had to take 1 long semester and 2 short semesters, and that was it. I received my degree. At that time, I thought, well, I'll go back to Virginia and I'll teach school, because I had taught out at Albuquerque in the school there for 4 years. So in the meantime, I received this letter from this colonel in New Jersey that had been one of my students at Albuquerque, and he asking me if I would like to come there and have a job with him in training people on new munitions. So I said, that sounds interesting. Didn't even ask him how much it paid, so we just packed up and loaded the stuff into the car and moved out to New Jersey. And went to work there with the Munitions Research and Development Command. They were developing all kinds of exotic munitions. So as they would develop the munitions, I would go out and train the people out in the field how to use them. Not realizing when I accepted the job that I was going to have to go to Vietnam. And I did 6 different times. Short trips, anywhere from 30 days up to 6 months. But that was equally as frightening under some of the conditions in Vietnam, when you'd be out in these fire bases at night, and the word would come down, we expect an attack tonight. They had these radar positioned around the fire base to pick up sound and movement. Of course, the sound it was picking up may have been an elephant or a tiger. You didn't know what it was, but they always anticipated it was the Viet Cong trying to sneak in. But they would take good care of us. They would give us a GI uniform to wear and combat boots and a flak jacket and a steel helmet and an M16 rifle. So this is the way we would travel to, and sometimes we'd go in. Primarily we were working with the helicopter gunship units. The munitions that we would develop at that time was a specialty type munition for the 2.75 rocket. So we would go out with these helicopter units, and we would have to fly with the pilots, giving them tips on how to employ the munitions more effectively. And sometimes if it was a safe area that we could go in, it would set up a firing demonstration, set up boxes out there that they could come back and shoot at. We used a lot of flechette ammunition. I don't know if you know what flechettes are. It's like a nail with a pointed head and a square tail fin on it. And you could package several thousand of those in a rocket. And once it was fired from the helicopter gunship, it would eject those flechettes. And if you caught people out in the open or even maybe just under foliage, it was terrible what you would do to these people. Sometimes if they were carrying a rifle like this, it would nail the wooden stock of the rifle right to the chest. But it was interesting in Vietnam because we moved every day, every second day, and go into a different situation working with a different unit. And when we would finish up, we would come back to Saigon, and I guess as a reward for just being there, they would ship us over to Bangkok. It was a CIA 727 that had a shuttle run every day, so we'd hop on that. We'd go to Bangkok and check into the local hotel and get all the dust and grime off of us and maybe shop for a couple of days and then come back to the Middle East, back to London, to New York. I did that, worked with munitions research and development for 21 years. And then I retired from that and we moved back to Virginia. And we had built a house there in 1960 when we were on our way to Germany, assuming, knowing that someday we were going to come back there. My wife is from that area, and I am also. So knowing that we were going to come back there, we built a house and we rented out for 20 plus years, and then we came back because we had to do a lot of fixing because tenants do not take care of a house like you would.
Did you raise a family, or?
We have 2 boys and 2 girls, all grown, all married, all have families, and all of them paying taxes. So we think we did a good job in that respect. We have 4 taxpayers now out on the rolls. We have 2 girls and 2 boys. The oldest one is here with us today, and she lives in Richmond. Her husband's a pediatrician, and our oldest son works in Pennsylvania. He's a state policeman. And our third one, the boy, he's an engineer with Bill Gates out in Seattle, Redmond, Washington. And he develops the software that tells the computer what to do. You know, the operations of the computers. And he's been out there 5 or 6 years now. So, and then our youngest daughter is married and lives in Richmond, and she has no children. They've only been married a couple of years.
All right. Well, I don't have any other questions. Would you like to end it off with anything, or?
very disturbed the trend of the American nation, the trend that we're going into now is, everything goes. It's homosexual in the military. The present administration that we have is, you could almost say is anti-military. They did break down and give the troops a pay raise. But I'm rather disappointed in the American people in general, the attitude that they have now against just common decency. And I think there must be a change made. Thank you for...
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It was a great interview.